You Can Change the World, The Christopher Approach by James Keller continues. Chapter Labor Management. Tremendous issues at stake. Leo was far ahead of his time, as Robert Wood Johnson in his book Our Forfeit Freedom, Doubleday, page 16 and 17, points out, since such ideas were almost heresy to the world of 1891. Since then, others have likewise concerned themselves with social justice, and quoting Mr. Johnson, when Federal Council of Churches of Christ in America, Protestant, first met in 1908, it adopted a 14-point social creed which advocated such measures as abolition of child labor, reduction of working hours, adoption of a living wage as a minimum in each industry, and suppression of this sweating system. In more general terms, the council also called for equitable division of the products of industry, for abatement of poverty, and for protection of workers against the results of rapid economic change. Christian leaders were joined by rabbinical bodies seeking modern application of Mosaic and Talmudic legislation. They supported bills guaranteeing workers the right to organize, outlawing child labor, establishing Social Security and old age pensions, setting up fair employment practices, and so on. They also declared it duty of society to use new machinery, skills, and productive power to banish hunger, unemployment, poor housing, and inadequate education from the social scene. There you have the pattern for the position of labor in the modern era, a pattern set forth by people of all religions and adhered to even by those with no formal religion, but who do have a good sense of moral values. This anonymity of opinion in such a vital field is significant for another reason, in addition to that of a desire for social justice, however, and emphasizes the fact that religion and labor are the two greatest bulwarks against totalitarianism in this country. The Reverend R.A. McGowan, director of the Social Action Department, National Catholic Welfare Conference, in an address before the convention of the CIO Textile Workers Union of America, held recently in Atlantic City, New Jersey, pointed out that when he said American labor does not look forward to being superseded sometime by an all-knowing, all-employing, all-trading, all-governing government, American labor has thought of its own personal dignity and personal responsibilities. So I place the American labor movement along with religion in the first line of defense against a totalitarian America. Labor and capital need each other. By no means is it suggested now or ever that some of the evils in our economic life, about which totalitarians rant and rave, do not exist in this country. Sad to say, they do exist, but the elimination of these evils does not require the destruction of our economic system. Again, the fault lies not so much in the system as in the greediness of man himself. And in attempting to resolve this condition, it must be realized very clearly that there will always be areas of difference between employers and employees. However, the Christopher point of view holds that these differences can exist without serious detriment to either side, provided honesty, decency, a sense of fair play, and acknowledgement of man's God-given dignity, rights, and responsibilities are mutually recognized. In other words, both sides must play the game according to the rules. The Marxists violently insist that capital and labor are necessarily hostile to each other. Their great mistake, to quote again from the Rerum Novarum, is to possess the idea that class is naturally hostile to class, that rich and poor are intended by nature to live at war with one another. So irrational and so false is this view that the exact contrary is the truth. Just as the symmetry of the human body is the result of the disposition of the members of the body, so in a state it is ordained by nature that these two classes should exist in harmony and agreement, and should, as it were, fit into one another, so as to maintain the equilibrium of the body politic. Each requires the other. Capital cannot do without labor, nor labor without capital. When this happy combination is liquidated, economic chaos is the inevitable result. For example, in a press dispatch dated May 5th, 1948, to the New York Times, from that newspaper's correspondent in Vienna, there is given striking proof how accurate such a statement is, referring to the acquisition of Austrian industries, confiscated as German property by the Reds and undertaken by them to be run along Marxist lines. The dispatch goes on to say, the trouble is that these industries have begun to produce not profits but losses. For a time in the USIA industries, as the Russians like to call them, looked like a good investment since the Russians took them over in 1945, complete with large stocks of raw material. 70% of their product was sold abroad for hard currencies or exported to the Soviet Union. The concerns were allowed to sell only 30% to Austria for shillings to pay their workers and to meet other overhead. Evidently concerned that capitalism was a simple process of profiteering, the USIA administrators set aside no capital reserves, allowed nothing for depreciation, made practically no new investments, and increased wages for political purposes. Then came currency reform, a general rise in wage scales, and the present severe deflation. By this time, the USIA industries were in debt from $15 million to $20 million to the Soviet military bank, and despite that bank's loans were behind in their tax and pension obligations. Their raw material stocks were depleted, and they were able only partly to renew them by compensation deals with Austrian concerns in the western zones or by pressing the Austrian government for allocations. Meanwhile, their overhead expenses increased, and Western occupation authorities had steadily forced down the Soviet bill against the Austrian government for occupation costs in an effort to get more shillings to pay their occupation army, which is larger than those of the three Western powers combined. The Russians opened a black market in Vienna. When this created a public scandal, they promptly closed it, but instead began, through Austrian concerns, to sell USIA products in Vienna, Salzburg, and Linz at gray market. None of these expenditures has been successful, and there have been purges in the USIA administration. It is reported that Russian experts in Moscow who understand the capitalist economics are not heeded. Others are too good Marxists to make a success of the USIA, which must compete in a more or less free market. An attempt was made to use the Communist Party in Linz to sell 100,000 pairs of USIA made shoes at 200 shillings a pair, but the workers could not afford them. From the satellite countries, notably Hungary, comes the same story, that capitalism and communism have not proved a good blend. It is better that the two should be together. So far in the United States, thank God, such a comparison disastrous as such a comparison is to the godless totalitarian philosophy. What about, churchy totalitarianism? That exists too, has not been allowed to reappear. And precisely, the godless totalitarian philosophy has not been allowed to appear. And precisely because it has been allowed to appear, capital and labor have been allowed the opportunity of ironing out their very differences within the framework of our democracy. Well, America is not a democracy, it never has been, but okay. In many respects, they have been able to draw more closely together through institutions and organizations which, on both sides, are able to present their points of view intelligently, and generally speaking, express the majority viewpoint of each group as a whole. In the field of labor, undoubtedly the most important of these organizations is the union, operating on the biblical theory that it is better, therefore, that two should be together than one, for they have the advantage of their society. If one fall, he shall be supported by the other. Woe to him that is alone, for when he falleth, he hath none to lift him up. Ecclesiastes 4, verses 9 through 10. Some 15 million workers in the United States have organized themselves into trade unions. These unions and the labor field in general offer a tremendously fertile field of activity for the Christ-bearer, the Christopher, who is aware of the necessity of bringing truth and its attributes to bear for the social justice of all. The men and women in these unions look to their leaders, great and small, for guidance in many spheres outside their own particular activity. The nature of that leadership, whether it be for better or worse, for good or for evil, depends on the part that each and every one of the 15 million members plays within his or her own group. Modern labor organizations are more than just collective bargaining agencies. They perform a variety of functions: economic, welfare, educational, community, and political. Considering these functions in order. Economic. Within recent years, particularly, it has become increasingly obvious that the primary purpose of any trade union is rightly defined as economic. It is the organization through which employees select their representatives who sit down with an employer are his representatives to discuss and decide upon working conditions, hours of employment, wages, pension, and retirement benefits, and other related questions. Through these trade unions, it has been possible to establish working and free living standards worthy of an American labor, worthy of a free man and a free democracy, welfare. Although the economic function is the foremost function of trade unions, it is not the only function. Many unions are also welfare and benevolent organizations. They set up funds and committees to take care of their sick members, to give decent burial to their dead, to provide insurance for the family of deceased unionists, to provide vacations and offer dental, medical, and optical care. Educational. Many trade unions have extensive training and cultural programs for their members and for the families of their members. Such education is fairly inclusive, going far beyond simple classes on how to be an effective unionist. There are song and drama groups, classes in history and economics, bowling, basketball, and softball teams, literary societies, and public speaking forums. In short, trade unions seek to fill gaps in the formal education of their members. Community. Many unions participate actively in the life of the community. They conduct drives to raise funds for the Red Cross, the community chest, and so on. They operate with other organizations and with local officials in sponsoring community agencies to care for the sick, the blind, the indigent, and the delinquent. Trade union members use these agencies, and trade unions often set up departments to guide their members in the use of such facilities. Yeah. In some cases, trade union representatives even sit on the local or national boards of these community agencies. Political. With functions as broad as those already listed, it is obvious that union organizations are more than casually concerned with legislation and government, since both these are directly associated with the civil and economic life of our country. This being the case, unions have also a political function. They have urged and continue to urge certain legislation concerning minimum wages, child labor, limitation of working hours, especially for women, prison labor, and acts pertaining to the legal relationships between labor and management. In addition, they are intensely interested in other general legislation which touches on the everyday life of the American workman, such as housing laws, slum clearance, health services, and even foreign policy. In a very real sense, then unions may be the voice of the working class community, and while they speak for the wage earner, they help also to shape the attitudes of the men and women who labor for a living. Naturally, it is small wonder that the Nazis and the fascists tried. Well, Nazi is a racial slur. NSDA, Nazi is, Hebrew for overseer. So it was used for a racial slur before Hitler, went for election. And fascists tried, and the communists still try, to penetrate the unions in order to dominate their functioning apparatus and thus determine their course of action. Also, it is extremely enlightening to note that the fascists, NSDAP, and now the communists, all of whom claimed and still claim to speak for the man in the street, immediately stifle free trade unionism as one of their first acts upon seizing would be the better word, power. The totalitarians may allow the trade union forms to exist, but they destroy their several functions because they know that the unions can be a powerful and effective force in upsetting tyranny. That is why the enemies of democracy immediately outlaw the right of the workmen to strike and to bargain freely for higher wages and better working conditions. Those courageous enough to attempt to do either of these two things promptly find themselves ticketed for the salt mines, the concentration camps, and even the terror-filled ride in the night from which there is no return, merely a notice to the victim's family that he or she has conveniently committed suicide. Striking proof that this is happening, and happening almost every day, is contained in a United Press release from Berlin on May 8, 1948, with the caption above the release reading "Strike broken, red style." The dispatch goes on to say, the newspaper Der Tagesspiegel reported today that the Russian management of a Soviet corporation at Espenheim offered German workers a free trip when they threatened to strike for more food. Workers who wanted to strike were advised to report for a journey to Siberia. There was no strike. That last sentence bears repeating. There was no strike. Short, snappy, almost anticlimactic. Yet the totalitarians in our midst, especially those who have fallen hook, line, and sinker for the party line without themselves actually being card-carrying party members, would do well to ponder over those few words. For those who would substitute for our free way of life, even with its imperfections, the terror, violence, and death of the godless, here is actual proof, and just one of the countless instances of what happens when the God-given rights of man are trampled under the hobnailed boots of tyrannical, so-called classless states. A field for positive and constructive action. Precisely because trade unions in a democracy such as ours are so influential a force in the basic segment of American life, the wage earner, the possibilities for positive and constructive action, particularly by the Christophers and such groups, are almost unlimited. Almost from its beginning, the trade union movement has had its wings. Some of these favored radical action, others a more conservative approach. Some wanted a greater emphasis on politics, others abhorred political action. Some preferred the craft form of organization, others the industrial form of grouping. To understand the situation completely, however, the Christopher must fully understand the part the American communists have played within the labor movement. Communism introduced a new element into the trade unions. Its disciples did not look upon the trade union primarily as a means of meeting the day-to-day needs of working people. They viewed unions as a means towards the seizure of political power and the establishment of a proletarian dictatorship over all of society, including the unions. And to accomplish this, they brought into the different groups of organized labor the concept of the fraction, a body of disciplined and trained communists inside a trade union whose purpose was to bore from within, with the aim either to rule the group or ruin its effectiveness for good. And through these fractions, or cells, they tried, and still continue to try, to do both. In the middle of the 1920s, the Common Era, they set up their trade union educational league to start their process of infiltration. When they subsequently failed, they decided to pull out and put up counter-unions in opposition to those existing among the rank and file of American working men. These countergroups were known as the Trade Union Unity League, although its objective was anything but unity. Again, having failed to meet with any degree of success, they returned to the fold of organized labor around 1934, and under orders from Moscow began anew the process of boring from within. Often concealing their identity and subversive affiliations, they offered themselves as organizers. They plunged into the thick of things. They didn't sit on the sidelines and hope to revolutionize by wishful thinking and inaction. In this work of organization, they showed great courage, vast skill, and endless zeal. They were rewarded for their apostolic efforts. They won leadership in many labor groups simply because they came in with a fixed purpose and worked unceasingly and devotedly to reach their goal. Their success, incomplete as it is, has been out of all proportion to their members. This organized minority has gained key positions and helped swing many labor policies to the left, mainly because they have had the zeal for spreading the darkness of subversion, while those possessed of the light of truth have so far not made their voices and actions felt in sufficient volume. If ever there was a challenge to the good, sound-thinking Americans to regain the initiative out of the hands of these godless and out of the hands of the unscrupulous and dishonest who may not be totalitarian-minded, that this is it. To be effective, however, the Christopher must not rush pell-mell onto the scene, expecting to turn the tables overnight. A careful study of the entire field of labor, organized labor in particular, will give him or her the chance to decide upon the job for which he or she is best suited. First, there are the regular full-time administrative positions, such as the walking delegates and the business agents, the presidents and managers. These are men whose primary concern is hearing grievances and settling them, and in addition, shaping the general policy of the organization. In some instances, these posts are elective. In others, they are appointive. In most cases, they are filled by men and women who have worked their way up in the union from the ranks. In some instances, however, outsiders hold these positions. Second, there are the field men, usually referred to as the organizers. These people have a hard assignment. They are trade union missionaries, carrying the union gospel to the unorganized. They must have imagination, determination, and courage. So arduous are their tasks that very often, after they have organized some corner of the nation, they settle down to become administrators. Delegates are agents. Third, there are the labor lawyers. These men are generally much more than ordinary attorneys. They help negotiate agreements, advise unions on legal matters, guide administrations on political and legislative policy. In many unions, the lawyer is the dominant figure behind the scenes. Right now, and in the foreseeable future, there is a very great need to get more Christophers into this particular phase of the labor field. To illustrate this need, not so long ago, at a diplomatic reception in Washington, D.C., One of the guests overheard a young Jewish lawyer discussing with some friends the labor situation and its effect on our national life. As this lawyer continued to talk, it became increasingly evident that his views almost paralleled those of the Christophers in the economic field. Curious to know the reason for these opinions, the guest made it his business to take the lawyer's side after the discussion had ended and politely questioned him. The answers he received were enlightening, to say the least. "I can understand your curiosity," this Jewish gentleman told him, "but to give you the whole story, I'll have to tell you what happened when I first began to study law. It was up at Harvard, and the opening speech that our professor, a non-Catholic by the way, gave us has stuck in my mind ever since. He told us if we want to do our country a real service, we have to concentrate on labor, not corporation law. Most of us had intended to do just the opposite, for the very commercial reason that there was more money in corporation practice. But what that professor said changed the minds of quite a few of us. He pointed out the need for men with sound American doctrine to get into organized labor with as much enthusiasm as with vicious and totalitarian ideas had done so far. He finished with the words, "If you want the best background for labor law, study Papal Encyclical Rerum Novarum of Leo XIII. Read that, and you'll never regret it. I gave that same advice last year and the year before, to the Catholic students especially, but they didn't see fit to take it. All of them took up corporation law instead." "Yet you didn't," the guest interrupted admiringly. The Jewish lawyer smiled. "Not only I, but 6 other Jewish boys in the class as well. Maybe some of the other students went into labor law too, but I couldn't vouch for it. I do know we 7 Jewish lads took the professor's advice. We keep in touch with each other fairly often, and I can tell you one thing, neither of us has ever regretted making the decision we did. When more and more Christophers echo these words, the tide will begin to turn away from the godless and back to the God-given tradition upon which America was founded." But to continue the discussion of the positions that an ordinary Christopher can fill. Fourthly, there are labor educators. This category includes educational directors, librarians, teachers, group workers, dramatic directors, athletic coaches. Fifth, there are the labor journalists. Every national or international union puts out a magazine or newspaper. In addition, many local unions do the same. Modern unions have press agents, publicists, pamphleteers, reporters. There is a job for the man or woman just out of college, and for the newspaper man with a generation of experience. The 6th classification covers labor political organizers. Almost every major union group has its political action committee, or its league for political education. Many individual unions have their own political departments. Now, America was founded on a secular structure, but one of the things about its secular structure is the rights and what's right about it existed within, religious systems. Not saying that those systems, all those systems had, some of the benefits. I'm just saying that, nothing good about America was new. Labor research and statistical personnel are included in the 7th classification. Generally speaking, these people are economists. Often, they are men and women with high standing in their profession. Sometimes they are assistants with a secondary school background. In the 8th, last but not least effective group are the administrative staffs of the trade unions, clerks, typists, secretaries, and accountants. These are all full-time jobs. They compose the paid apparatus of the union. However, there are other jobs that are not full-time paid positions, but which offer, in some cases, an even greater opportunity for a worker to be effective in shaping for the good the character of his or her own union. For example, There are the shop stewards, men, and sometimes women generally elected by the workers in an office or factory, or in a section of some branch of a particular industry. Their duties are to handle grievances at the plant or office level, to collect dues, and to transfer the policy and plans of the union to the rank and file of its members. Shop stewards are the equivalent of the non-commissioned officers in the Army or Navy, especially for one very important detail. Very often they are the makers of policy as well as its executors. Usually they enjoy the confidence of their fellow wage earners, and because of this confidence can be an extremely powerful force for good. They can be real leaders, not only in handling grievances, but also in shaping the general thinking of the people in their office or plant. They can guide their fellow employees in their voting when the time comes to choose union officers. They can keep their associates alerted on what is happening inside the union, as well as give advice on different courses of action to be taken and the methods to be used in pursuing those courses. In short, the shop steward is the backbone of the union. In addition, there are the board members of local unions. These are generally men and women who, while they work all day, serve on the executive board of their local union group on free evenings. They are not paid officials, but are regular workers who hold elective positions. Such men and women are usually highly respected members of their union, and by and large have risen to their positions from out of the ranks of the shop stewards. Board members hold policy-making posts, and as such, they can either make or break a union. Then, again, there are special official groups in offices and factories, such as grievance, legislative, political, organizing, and entertainment committees. In all of these posts, rank and filers assume the responsibilities of group leadership. The Christopher worker must look upon such posts not merely as routine positions, but as tremendous opportunities for doing good. By doing this, he or she can be the most effective single force in molding the thought and action of his or her co-workers. On the one hand, by any individual group who gets a group of close companions to vote him into a position and then proceeds to forget his responsibilities, would do much better not to get himself elected at all. His indolence will soon discredit him. He will harm himself and any cause or group with which he is affiliated. On the other hand, the Christopher worker who aspires to a union position, full-time paid or part-time voluntary, must be ready to do the job. Finally, at the base of the union is the individual worker. He or she does not stand out, as do those who hold paid positions or those who hold prominent non-paying posts. The individual worker is just another soldier in the army of the working people, yet in the final analysis, he or she is the most important person in the organization. Well, for themselves.